The Monarch Casino pulsed with energy, the low hum of conversation mingling with the sharp clink of glasses and the hypnotic whirl of roulette wheels. The room was a symphony of extravagance, velvet drapes, chandeliers dripping with crystals, and an air thick with the scent of aged whiskey and ambition. Madeline worked the main bar, moving with the kind of efficiency that came from years of practice. She could pour a martini, flirt just enough for a tip, and shut down an overconfident businessman's advances all in the same breath. She never wanted to stay in Vegas. That was the deal she made with herself when she first arrived, broke and 22, with nothing but a duffel bag and the remnants of a dream she barely remembered anymore. She told herself she'd only be here long enough to get back on her feet, to save enough for a real life, somewhere quieter. That was years ago. She was still here, still pouring drinks for men who barely made eye contact, still counting every dollar in tips and stuffing them into a jar labeled, "Someday," on top of her fridge. Her regulars liked her because she didn't fawn over them. The Monarch's clientele, high rollers, trust fund brats, tech moguls with money to burn, were used to being treated like kings. Madeline didn't bother. She kept it simple, professional, and efficient. They liked that. It gave them the illusion she was above it all, as if she were letting them in on some unspoken joke about the ridiculousness of wealth. Tonight, the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't just another night of easy money and expensive scotch. There was something heavier, more electric, a tension that settled like static before a storm. That was when she saw him. Dominic Hayes moved through the casino with the confidence of a man who owned everything in sight. He didn't, technically, the Monarch belonged to someone even richer than him, but the way he carried himself, the way the room seemed to bend around him, made it feel like he did. He was all sharp angles and expensive tailoring, his expression unreadable, his presence impossible to ignore. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in this town knew his name. He was the kind of billionaire who made his fortune through ruthless precision, a man who never gambled because he never needed luck. He only played games he was certain to win. The Monarch's manager, a man who had never cared about anyone lower than a VIP cardholder, practically tripped over himself to greet Dominic. The poker room had been prepped for weeks in anticipation of his arrival. The stakes would be higher than ever tonight, and the guest list had been carefully curated. This wasn't just a game, it was a spectacle. Madeline had seen men like Dominic before. They came to Vegas for one of two reasons, either to lose themselves or to prove they were untouchable. He didn't look like a man who lost at anything. She turned her attention back to the bar, wiping the counter as a new group of guests arrived, their laughter too loud, their watches just a little too shiny. One of them, already a little glassy-eyed, waved her over, ordering something ridiculous that would take too much time. She gave him the kind of smile that said she'd make it if she felt like it. "You're a tough one," the man mused, leaning in. "I like that." Madeline had perfected the art of smiling without meaning it. She gave him just enough to let him believe he had a chance and then walked away before he could say something she'd have to pretend to laugh at. She didn't care about men like that. What caught her attention was Dominic, now seated at the poker table, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He listened more than he spoke, reading every player at the table like they were giving away their strategies with their breathing. The game hadn't even started, and he had already won. She didn't know why she kept watching him. Maybe it was because he didn't glance around the room the way the others did, searching for distractions, for validation. Maybe it was the way he drummed his fingers against the table, absent-minded but controlled, as if the entire night was just a formality. Or maybe it was just because she wanted to know what kind of man he really was, if he was exactly what everyone said or if there was something else beneath the carefully crafted armor. Either way, it didn't matter. He was just another player in a city full of them. She had drinks to pour, tips to earn, and a dream she had almost given up on to keep alive. The night stretched on, the casino buzzing with anticipation, the weight of fortune and failure hanging over the tables. Madeline moved through it all, unnoticed by most, but aware of everything. And Dominic played his game, cool and calculated, never once letting the mask slip. Madeline balanced the tray on the tips of her fingers, moving through the crowded casino floor with the kind of practiced ease that made it look effortless. The Monarch wasn't just another Vegas casino, it was the kind of place where the carpets never showed a stain, where the bartenders were trained like sommeliers, and where the people drinking $1,000 scotch barely looked at the staff bringing it to them. The tray carried 4 cocktails, each carefully garnished, perfectly chilled, absurdly priced. The man at table 5 had ordered a boulevardier but insisted it be served with a single, hand-cut ice sphere. Another had demanded a martini stirred exactly 45 times, and a third, some hedge fund type in a watch worth more than her entire net worth, had requested his old-fashioned with just a whisper of orange. They all wanted to believe they had special, highly specific tastes, when really, they just liked making other people work a little harder for them. It was a game, just like the one they played at the tables, one designed to remind people like Madeline exactly where she stood. She stepped carefully past a group gathered near the high-stakes poker room, where the real money flowed. The chatter swirled around her, full of the meaningless, self-important kind of laughter that filled rooms like this. She'd been here long enough to recognize the voices before even seeing their faces. She caught pieces of conversation, some tech startup sale, a house in the Hamptons, the difficulty of finding good help. It was always some variation of the same thing. She had just maneuvered past the first table when someone, hit her hard from the side. The tray tipped before she could catch it, and in an instant, the drinks went flying. A glass tumbled, bounced off the edge of a chair, and shattered against the floor. The martini splashed down the front of a man's suit, dark liquid soaking into the crisp white fabric. The room hushed, not entirely silent, but close. A few gasps. Some poorly hidden laughter. The kind of reaction that told her exactly how bad this was before she even looked up. Dominic Hayes sat back in his chair, expression carved from stone, staring at the stain spreading across his shirt and jacket. The man who had stumbled into her, some drunk finance guy too deep into whatever he'd been drinking, muttered an apology, barely coherent, and staggered off toward the bar. But Dominic didn't seem to care about him. His focus was entirely on Madeline. She knew who he was. Everyone here did. He wasn't loud or flashy like some of the other billionaires who passed through. He didn't wear ostentatious jewelry, didn't surround himself with women too young for him, didn't revel in the spectacle of his own wealth. But that made him even more dangerous. His power wasn't something he flaunted, it was something he carried so absolutely that it didn't need to be spoken aloud. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Not in surprise, not in amusement, just a cold, assessing stare that sent a flicker of something unpleasant through her chest. Then he spoke. "You have got to be kidding me." The words weren't loud, but they cut through the space between them with ease. Madeline inhaled slowly, keeping her grip on what was left of the tray. "I'm very sorry, sir. Let me. Do you have any idea what this suit costs?" His voice didn't rise, but the weight of it made her stomach tighten. "It was an accident," she said, steady but careful. "An accident," he repeated, like the concept itself was offensive. He pulled the napkin from the table and dabbed at the stain, but it only made it worse. His jaw tensed. "You work here, don't you?" Madeline felt every pair of eyes in the room pressing in, waiting for her to shrink under the weight of his glare. "Yes," she said. "Well, you shouldn't," he said. "You're incompetent." There was a shift in the air, a collective inhale, a ripple of something between amusement and discomfort. At the bar, a group of men exchanged looks, enjoying the show. A woman near the poker room hid a smirk behind her glass. Madeline could feel the heat creeping up the back of her neck, but she didn't drop her gaze. "Again, I apologize," she said, each word carefully measured. "I'll make sure your drink is replaced." "I don't care about the drink," Dominic snapped. He tossed the napkin onto the table, now useless. "I care about incompetence." It was the way he said it, like it was a diagnosis. Like she was a problem that needed fixing. She had worked in places like this long enough to know how she was supposed to respond. Apologize again, duck her head, pretend like she wasn't embarrassed. But something about the way he said it, the dismissiveness, the absolute certainty that she was nothing more than a mistake in his evening, made her bite down hard against the instinct to play along. She met his gaze evenly. I understand that you're upset, sir, she said, voice calm. I'll be happy to cover the dry cleaning bill. His brow lifted just slightly, the closest thing to surprise she'd seen from him. It wasn't the reaction he'd expected. I don't think you understand anything, he said, pushing his chair back. He stood, shaking out his jacket with a sharp flick of his wrist. And I don't think you should be working here. Madeline's grip on the tray tightened. Sir, She won't be, a new voice cut in. She turned just in time to see the manager hurrying toward them, his usual, plastic smile twisted into something closer to panic. Mr. Hayes, he said, stepping in between them, I sincerely apologize for this unacceptable mistake. He didn't even glance at Madeline. I assure you, she'll be let go immediately. It took a second for the words to sink in. The tightness in Madeline's chest deepened, a sharp pang of something between anger and humiliation. Just like that. No conversation. No chance to explain. Dominic didn't even look at her anymore. He barely seemed interested in the exchange at all. He just nodded once, dismissive, already turning away as if she had never existed in the first place. The room shifted back into motion around her. Laughter started up again. Glasses clinked. The tension that had built up in the last few minutes evaporated now that the spectacle was over. Madeline forced herself to breathe. She looked at the manager. I'll get my things, she said. And then she walked away, tray in hand, feeling every single step like it was another part of her being erased. Madeline shoved open the employee exit of the Monarch Casino, the heavy door slamming behind her with a finality that made her stomach twist. The dry desert air hit her face, warm even in the late-night hours, but nothing could burn away the sting of what had just happened. She had been humiliated, tossed aside like she was disposable, and worst of all, she had let herself believe she was past this. That she was too sharp, too careful, too good at her job to be blindsided by men like Dominic Hayes. She should have known better. She stalked across the pavement, her work heels clicking against the ground, each step fueled by the sharp-edged humiliation clawing at her chest. She had lost jobs before. Vegas was built on turnover. But this wasn't some understaffed dive bar where losing a shift meant bouncing to another spot down the strip. The Monarch was a career move, a steady paycheck, a place where rich men's guilt translated into tips fat enough to shove into her someday jar. Except now, there was no paycheck. No tips. No safety net. Her beat-up sedan was parked in the back lot, a spot she always chose because the security cameras covered it. The car was a relic from another life, the paint sun-faded, the radio temperamental. She sank into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, trying to steady the knot of anger in her chest. She could feel the humiliation curdling into something heavier, something close to rage. It wasn't just that Dominic had gotten her fired. It was the way he had done it. Dismissing her, like she wasn't even worth his attention. He hadn't needed to argue. He hadn't even needed to raise his voice. One sentence, one flick of his wrist, and she was erased. She took a deep breath and dug her phone out of her bag. The screen glowed with unread messages, mostly from Naomi, her only real friend in this town. Naomi, what happened? I heard something went down. Naomi, are you okay? Naomi, Maddie, talk to me. She let the phone drop into her lap, closing her eyes. Naomi meant well, but there was nothing to say. She had no backup plan. No job lined up. Rent was due in 2 weeks. Vegas chewed people up like this all the time. One bad night, and everything could spiral. The thought made her pulse quicken, and she turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed before settling into a low, uneven hum. She put the car in gear, her grip on the wheel too tight, and pulled out of the lot. She drove without thinking, winding through the neon-lit streets, past tourists clutching oversized margaritas and couples dressed for a night they'd forget by morning. She had spent years watching them, serving them, laughing at their terrible jokes. They were here to escape. She had always been the one standing still. But now? Now, she wasn't sure she was standing at all. Underscore 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 underscore. Dominic woke to the sound of his phone vibrating relentlessly on the marble nightstand. He ignored it at first, rolling onto his back, blinking at the ceiling. Then another call. And another. His jaw clenched as he reached for it. Weston's name flashed across the screen. Dominic answered. "There's a problem," Weston said, his voice clipped. "A big one." Dominic swung his legs out of bed, already moving. "How bad?" Weston didn't answer right away, and Dominic felt something cold settle in his chest. Weston didn't hesitate unless the news was catastrophic. "Your accounts," Weston said finally. "They're empty." Dominic stopped moving. "What?" "Every account. Every holding. Your company's stock is frozen. Someone drained everything overnight." Dominic stared at the floor, the words sliding over him in a way that didn't make sense. His head was still clouded with sleep, but this was waking him up fast. "That's not possible," he said. "It shouldn't be," Weston agreed. "But it happened. You need to get in here. Now." Dominic didn't respond. He was already grabbing his clothes. Underscore 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 underscore. Madeline woke up late, which was rare. Her body was used to running on too little sleep, used to dragging itself out of bed for a morning shift after a night of dealing with entitled men who thought ordering drinks counted as a personality trait. But this morning, there was no shift to rush to. She groaned and rolled over, rubbing her eyes before grabbing her phone. No missed calls. No job. No plan. She exhaled and forced herself to get up, feet hitting the old apartment carpet. The place was small, barely more than a studio, with a creaky mattress and a kitchen that only half worked. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For now. She grabbed a hoodie off the chair, pulling it over her tank top as she wandered toward the fridge. Maybe she could text Naomi, ask if her bar had any extra shifts. Maybe she could check one of the lesser casinos, ones that didn't mind hiring someone who had been fired from a high-end place like the Monarch. She sighed, rubbing her temples, then tapped her banking app out of habit. She had avoided looking at it last night. She already knew what it would say. But when the numbers appeared on the screen, she froze. It wasn't her usual balance. It wasn't even close. The number was staggering. Impossible. Millions of dollars. Deposited overnight. She sat down hard, staring at the screen, her heart hammering. This had to be a mistake. She closed the app and reopened it. Still there. She scrolled through the transactions, her breath catching when she saw where the money had come from. Dominic Hayes. She nearly dropped the phone. This had to be some kind of accounting error. Or fraud. Or, God, she didn't even know what. Her hands shook as she navigated to her messages and tapped out a text to Naomi. Madeline, you're not going to believe this. She stared at the screen, waiting for a response, but her mind was racing too fast to focus. She needed answers. She needed to figure out what the hell was happening. She needed to get out of here. But instead, she just sat there, the phone heavy in her hands, the impossible weight of those numbers staring back at her, as if they were daring her to do something. The room was in chaos. The kind of chaos that Dominic Hayes did not tolerate, did not understand, and certainly did not expect to find in his own headquarters at 7 in the morning. His financial team, hand-picked, overpaid, and allegedly brilliant, was scrambling, their faces pale, their voices overlapping in a symphony of disaster. Screens glowed with numbers that made no sense, accounts that should have been untouchable showing a balance of exactly 0. Dominic stood in the center of it all, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He had built his empire on control. Every dollar, every investment, every contingency was accounted for. He did not make reckless decisions. He did not gamble. And yet, in less than 24 hours, his entire fortune had vanished. Say it again, he said, voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. His CFO, a man who had been with him long enough to know not to waste time sugarcoating disaster, exhaled through his nose. Every account has been drained. Holdings are frozen. The transactions were masked, rerouted through shell accounts. Whoever did this knew exactly how to cover their tracks. Dominic's fingers tapped once against his bicep, his only outward sign of irritation. And yet you found the money. The CFO hesitated. Yes. And? Another pause. Dominic's patience, already worn thin, snapped. Just say it. The transfers, the CFO said finally, lead to a personal account belonging to someone named Madeline Carter. Silence. A strange, still moment where Dominic felt the room shift around him. He knew that name. The bartender. His irritation gave way to something colder, something dangerously close to fury. He had barely registered her existence last night. She was just another employee in a city full of them. And yet, his money, his entire empire, had landed in her lap. A brilliant hacker? A con artist? It seemed absurd. She had looked stunned when he had humiliated her, not smug. He had dismissed her entirely, convinced she was just another casualty of bad luck. But this? This was not luck. He turned to Weston, the only person in the room who wasn't hunched over a screen or muttering into a headset. His chief investigator stood calm, arms at his sides, waiting. Find her, Dominic said. Now. Underscore 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 underscore. Madeline didn't believe in signs. But if she did, she would have thought this was one. She sat in the bank lobby, gripping her phone so tightly her fingers hurt. The air conditioning was too cold, the scent of coffee from the corner station too strong. Everything felt surreal, like she had stepped into someone else's life by accident. The bank manager, a man in his 60s with a tan that suggested he spent more time golfing than managing, sat across from her, beaming like they were old friends. I have to say, he told her, this is one of the largest personal deposits I've ever seen. Quite the windfall. Windfall. That was a word people used when they won the lottery. When a long-lost relative left them an inheritance. Not when millions of dollars mysteriously landed in their account overnight. She forced a breath, steadying herself. There has to be a mistake. The manager chuckled, as if she had made a joke. No mistake at all. The transfers are legitimate, cleared by multiple levels of authorization. He slid a folder toward her. You'll find all the documentation here. I assume you'll want to move some of it to a private account? We can set that up today. Madeline stared at the papers, words blurring. She had come here expecting, hoping, they would tell her it was all an error. That she wasn't about to become the center of some elaborate financial scandal. Instead, the bank manager was congratulating her. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Can you tell me who made the transfer? The manager tapped the document. Mr. Dominic Hayes. Her stomach dropped. Of all the people in Vegas, of all the accounts in the world, the money had come from him? She forced her voice to stay steady. And you're sure this was authorized? Absolutely. The manager beamed. Quite generous, really. Generous. Right. Because Dominic Hayes was known for his generosity. She swallowed against the wave of panic rising in her throat. This was wrong. It had to be. Maybe it was some kind of glitch. Maybe someone was setting her up. The problem was, she didn't know where to go, who to ask. And the longer she sat here, the more it felt like she was trapped in something she didn't understand. She stood abruptly, pushing the chair back. I need to go. The manager blinked. Miss Carter, we haven't. Later, she said, stuffing the paperwork into her bag. I need to think. And then she walked out, stepping back into the too bright Vegas sun, the weight of impossible money sitting heavy in her bag. Underscore 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 underscore. Weston moved through the casino with the quiet efficiency that made him so good at his job. He didn't need to flash a badge or make threats. People talked to him because he knew how to make them feel like it was in their best interest to do so. The Monarch's staff had been eager to tell him everything about Madeline Carter. How long she'd worked there. Where she lived. How she'd been fired last night. Fired by Dominic himself. That part intrigued him. He had expected to find that she was a seasoned scammer, someone with a history of financial fraud. But she wasn't. She had no criminal record, no suspicious connections, nothing that suggested she was capable of pulling off the kind of heist they were dealing with. And yet, the money had ended up in her account. He stepped outside, pressing a number on his phone. Anything? Dominic's voice was clipped. She's not what I expected, Weston admitted. Meaning? She's not a professional. She's a bartender who got fired last night and now has millions of your dollars sitting in her bank account. A beat of silence. Where is she now? Weston glanced at his watch. Bank of Nevada. She was inside for about 10 minutes. Left in a hurry. Dominic's voice was colder now. Follow her. Weston was already moving. I already am. Weston sat behind the wheel of his black SUV, parked 2 spots away from Madeline Carter's rusted sedan, watching as she sat frozen in the driver's seat. She had left the bank minutes ago, walking fast, shoulders tense, gripping a folder of paperwork like it might catch fire in her hands. Now, she wasn't moving. She was just staring at the dashboard, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel in an erratic rhythm. Weston had tailed enough people to know the signs. She was spiraling. Dominic had given him one order, find her. But Weston wasn't the kind of investigator who walked into a situation blind. He preferred to study people before making a move. And Madeline? She was interesting. She wasn't some slick con artist, wasn't a high-tech hacker pulling off the kind of financial heist that took years to master. She looked like a woman who had just been thrown into the deep end of something she didn't understand. He watched as she finally exhaled sharply, shook her head, and threw the car into reverse, tires jerking against the curb as she pulled out of the lot. He waited a beat before following. She didn't take the direct route home. Instead, she drove aimlessly, looping through side streets, stopping at red lights that had just turned yellow, checking her rearview mirror a little too often. She knew she was being followed. Or, at the very least, she suspected it. Smart. But not smart enough to lose him. After nearly 20 minutes of circling, she pulled into the parking lot of a rundown diner on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzed louder than the customers inside. Weston parked a few spots away, watching as she climbed out, rolled her shoulders like she was shaking something off, and stepped inside. She slid into a booth near the window, tapping her nails against the table. A waitress, older, with tired eyes and a kind smile, approached. Madeline ordered coffee. Nothing else. Weston stayed put. He had time. Her life had been easy enough to trace. Born in a town no one had heard of, raised by a single mother who hadn't been particularly good at the job. No siblings. No college degree. No close friends listed on any social media accounts. Just years of moving from one low-paying job to another, never quite making it out, never quite going under. A woman who had been surviving for so long, she probably didn't even remember what thriving looked like. He had spent the night combing through records, digging into her history. No criminal record, no offshore accounts, no secret ties to anyone capable of orchestrating a financial attack on one of the most powerful men in the country. Just a bartender with a past that read like 100 other people in this city, people who came looking for a fresh start and got stuck in a cycle they couldn't break. Years ago, Madeline had arrived in Vegas with nothing but a duffel bag and a plan. The plan had been vague, something about finding a decent job, saving enough to leave, heading somewhere quieter, somewhere easier. But plans like that rarely held up against reality. Rent was high, jobs paid just enough to keep you one step away from broke, and before she knew it, she was doing double shifts at a low-end casino bar, serving drinks to men who barely made eye contact. Then came the monarch. A step up. A job that felt, if not stable, then at least predictable. She had learned quickly, figured out which regulars tipped best, how to cut a man off without bruising his ego, how to keep herself from getting dragged into the kind of trouble that swallowed people whole in this city. Her mother had been the kind of woman who ran when things got hard. She had packed a bag one night when Madeline was 18, left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "You'll figure it out. You always do," and never came back. Madeline had figured it out. But she hadn't left, not really. She had stayed in a different way, stuck in a city that never let go, waiting for a moment she hadn't even realized she had given up on. And now, overnight, she was a millionaire. Weston watched as she wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, fingers tapping absently against the ceramic. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't even relieved. She looked like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. That, at least, was smart. Because it would. It always did. Madeline's phone buzzed on the table. She hesitated before picking it up, squinting at the screen. Whatever she saw made her shoulders tighten. She answered, pressing the phone to her ear, her voice low but sharp. He couldn't hear her from where he was sitting, but he could read body language better than most. She was being warned. Maybe by a friend. Maybe by someone at the bank who had realized exactly whose money she had been given. Maybe by someone who had been following the same trail Weston was on. She hung up quickly, tossed a few bills onto the table, and stood, glancing toward the window. Her gaze flickered over the parking lot, pausing for a fraction of a second on his car before moving on. She knew. Weston sighed, rolling his neck before stepping out of the SUV. He wasn't trying to hide. There was no point. She was already outside by the time he reached her. "Are you following me?" she asked, voice sharp. He didn't answer immediately, just watched her. Up close, she was thinner than she looked in the security footage from the Monarch, dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't had a decent night's sleep in a while. She had that exhausted, wary look that people got when they'd been knocked down too many times and were still waiting for the next hit. "I think you already know the answer to that," he said finally. She crossed her arms. "Who are you?" He considered lying. Instead, he just said, "Weston." Her eyes narrowed. "And who do you work for, Weston?" "You know who." Her jaw tightened. "Then tell him I don't know what's going on. I didn't steal anything. I don't even want the money." Weston tilted his head slightly. "That's an interesting thing to say." "Yeah? Why?" "Because people who come into millions of dollars overnight usually don't panic and run to a bank to try to give it back." She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know what's happening. But I didn't do anything wrong." Weston believed her. That didn't mean Dominic would. Madeline stepped out of her apartment building and immediately spotted the black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't paranoia. It was just sitting there, engine off, windows dark, like it had been waiting for her. Again. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she walked to her car, refusing to look in its direction. If she was being followed, fine. Let them watch. She didn't have anything to hide, except, of course, the impossible number in her bank account that still felt like a bomb waiting to go off. She had spent the last 2 days trying to go about her life as if everything was normal. Coffee in the morning, job applications she wasn't actually submitting, ignoring Naomi's increasingly frantic texts about free money and international crime rings. She hadn't touched the money. Hadn't spent a cent. But she also hadn't figured out what to do with it, which was somehow worse. The SUV had been outside her building yesterday, too. And the night before. She told herself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe it belonged to one of her neighbors. Maybe she was making something out of nothing. But then she saw it again at the grocery store, parked at the end of the lot, just far enough away that it could be nothing. Or everything. By the time she had gotten home, she was pacing her apartment, restless, her gut twisting with something close to panic. Maybe it was time to leave. Just pack up and go somewhere, anywhere. The thought of slipping out in the middle of the night, disappearing into a different city, had a certain appeal. She could withdraw some of the money, nothing too flashy, just enough to get out, to start over. But every time she got close to making that decision, something held her back. She wasn't a criminal. She hadn't done anything wrong. And if she ran, wouldn't that make her look guilty? She had spent too much of her life running. From small towns, from bad jobs, from people who let her down. She was tired of it. And now, she was being watched. Underscore 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 underscore. Dominic wasn't known for his patience. "She's not going anywhere," Weston had assured him that morning. "She's too freaked out. She hasn't even touched the money." Yet, Dominic had muttered. Now, standing in his office, looking at the financial reports that still showed his accounts as a disaster zone, he was done waiting. This wasn't a game of strategy, where he could sit back and observe. It was time to move things forward. "Enough of this," he said. "Bring her in." Weston, sitting across from him, raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Dominic leveled him with a look. "She's walking around with my money, living in an apartment like nothing happened. I think it's time we had a conversation." Weston didn't argue. He just nodded, already reaching for his phone. "I'll take care of it." Underscore 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 underscore. Madeline had just gotten home, dropped her bag on the kitchen counter, and kicked off her shoes when there was a knock at the door. Not a friendly, neighborly knock. A sharp, decisive one. Her stomach twisted. She stayed still for a second, pulse quickening, telling herself it was nothing. Then came another knock. Harder. She hesitated before moving to the peephole, pressing her eye to the glass. A man stood outside. Tall, dark suit, controlled posture. Not the kind of person who sold vacuums or asked if she had a moment to discuss the state of her soul. Her fingers hovered over the lock. She could ignore it. Pretend she wasn't home. But something told her that wasn't going to make a difference. She cracked the door open an inch. "Can I help you?" The man didn't smile. "Miss Carter. My name is Weston. I work for Dominic Hayes." Her grip on the door tightened. "Yeah," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Good for you." Weston didn't blink. "He'd like to speak with you." She let out a short laugh, one that was more nerves than humor. "I bet he would." "Now." The word was soft, but firm. She hesitated. She could refuse. Could slam the door, pretend like she had any real control over this situation. But Dominic Hayes wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer. And Weston didn't look like the type who left empty-handed. She exhaled slowly. "Fine. But I'm taking my own car." Weston nodded once, stepping back. "That's acceptable." She grabbed her keys, locked the door behind her, and followed him down the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Underscore 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 underscore. Dominic was waiting in the private lounge of a hotel he owned, the kind of place where business deals happened over whiskey that cost as much as rent. The room was sleek and modern, all dark wood and dim lighting, designed to put people at ease while also reminding them exactly how much money they didn't have. Madeline stepped inside, her shoulders squared, eyes sweeping the space before landing on him. She recognized him instantly. The last time she had seen him, he had been furious over a spilled drink. Now, his expression was unreadable. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly. "Have a seat." She didn't move. "You had me followed," she said, crossing her arms. Dominic leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You have my money." Madeline scoffed. "Oh, so you gave it to me?" "Because last I checked, I didn't do anything to make that happen." His eyes darkened. "You expect me to believe you don't know how that money ended up in your account?" "I don't know," she shot back. "And honestly, I don't want it." Dominic tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to decide if she was lying. "You haven't touched it," he said. It wasn't a question. Madeline narrowed her eyes. "No, I haven't. Because I'm not an idiot, and I figured the second I did, someone like you would come knocking." A flicker of something crossed his face, maybe amusement, maybe curiosity. "Smart," he admitted. She exhaled sharply. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not running some kind of scam, and I definitely didn't steal from you. So why don't you tell me what you think is happening?" Dominic leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Someone moved that money for a reason," he said. "Either to frame you, or to use you as a shield. And until I know which, you're not going anywhere. Madeline's stomach dropped. So that's it, she said. I just wait around until you figure it out? Dominic's expression was cool, controlled. For now, he said. Madeline clenched her jaw, every instinct screaming at her to argue, to fight, to run. But she didn't. Because as much as she hated to admit it, she needed answers too. Madeline had spent the entire conversation with Dominic trying not to lose her temper. The fact that she was being accused of orchestrating something that, by all accounts, had completely upended her life was infuriating. But more than that, it was terrifying. Because if she wasn't the one pulling the strings, then who was? Now, walking through the dimly lit parking garage beneath the hotel, she was still trying to make sense of everything. The meeting had ended with no real answers, just Dominic's unsettling promise that she wasn't going anywhere until he figured out what was really happening. And yet, he had let her leave. Maybe he wanted to see if she'd run. Maybe he was testing her. Or maybe he had already decided she was guilty and was just waiting for her to slip up. She pressed the button on her key fob, unlocking her car as her mind raced. She could still leave. She could take the money, disappear into another city, another life. But something told her that wouldn't save her. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. She barely had time to register the movement behind her before an arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off the ground. A hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the scream that rose in her throat. Her heart pounded as she kicked out, thrashing against the grip of whoever had grabbed her, but they were too strong, too fast. Another pair of hands grabbed her legs. She was dragged backward, her shoes scraping against the pavement. The van's side door slid open, and she was shoved inside, hitting the metal floor hard. She gasped, trying to suck in air, but the hands didn't let go. "Stay down," a voice growled. The van lurched forward. The scent of sweat and something metallic filled the cramped space. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She twisted, kicking blindly, her heel connecting with someone's ribs. A sharp grunt, a curse. The grip on her arms loosened for a split second, just enough. She yanked herself free, scrambling toward the door. The van jerked violently. Tires screeched. A deafening crunch echoed through the space as the entire vehicle tilted sideways, the force of the impact throwing her into the opposite wall. Shouts. A car alarm blaring. She barely had time to register what had happened before the doors were yanked open, flooding the space with harsh, artificial light. A hand reached for her. She flinched, pressing herself against the cold metal floor. "It's me," Weston said, his voice calm but urgent. "Come on." She stared at him, breath coming in ragged gulps. "Madeline, now." Her body moved before her brain caught up, her legs unsteady as she lunged toward him. He pulled her out of the wreckage, one strong arm steadying her as she stumbled onto the pavement. The van was totaled, its front end crushed where another SUV had plowed into it. A few feet away, two of the masked men lay motionless, groaning. Another was struggling against the grip of one of Dominic's security team members. And then she saw him. Dominic stood a few yards away, watching. Not barking orders. Not rushing forward. Just watching. His expression unreadable, his eyes sharp, calculating. She tore herself from Weston's grip, her body still buzzing with adrenaline. "What the hell?" "You're safer with us than on your own," Weston interrupted, his grip tightening just slightly before he let her go. She turned toward Dominic, her hands clenched into fists. "You think I planned that too?" His gaze flickered over her, assessing. If he had ever truly believed she was the mastermind, she could see it now, his certainty had cracked. "No," he said simply. Something cold settled in her stomach. If she wasn't the one they were after, that meant someone else wanted her out of the picture. And she had no idea who. Madeline sat in the back of Dominic's SUV, arms crossed so tightly they ached. Her mind was still racing, her heart still pounding from the van, the masked men, the way she had been yanked out of her own life and shoved into something that felt bigger, more dangerous, and completely out of her control. Weston sat beside her, silent. He hadn't spoken much since pulling her from the wreckage, just kept an eye on her like she might try to leap from the moving car. She had thought about it. But running wasn't an option, not anymore. The ride was smooth, the kind of luxury vehicle that glided over the pavement as if inconvenience was something other people dealt with. The city lights blurred past, but she barely saw them. Her jaw clenched tighter with every mile. By the time the car pulled into a private underground garage, her frustration was bubbling over. She was done waiting for answers. The elevator ride to the penthouse was fast, silent. The doors slid open to reveal a sprawling space, glass walls overlooking the Vegas skyline, furniture that looked expensive and unused, the kind of place that didn't feel like a home, just a statement. Dominic stood by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the city below like it was something he owned. Maybe he did. She stepped forward, her boots clicking against the polished floor. "You want to tell me what the hell is going on?" she said. Dominic turned, his expression unreadable. "I was hoping you'd tell me." Madeline let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Are you kidding? You've had me followed, dragged me here, and now you're still acting like I'm some kind of mastermind?" "You're not a mastermind," Dominic said, his voice cool. "But that doesn't mean you're innocent." She took a step closer. "You know what I think? I think you have no idea what's going on, and you don't like that. You're used to being in control, and this is throwing you off." His jaw tightened, just a flicker of irritation, but it was there. "Sit," he said. She didn't. He exhaled, like he was deciding how much patience he had left. "I had you followed because someone sent my money to your account," he said. "I assumed you were involved. Now I'm not so sure." She scoffed. "Wow. What an honor." His eyes stayed locked on hers. "Someone tried to take you tonight. That means you're a target, not just collateral." The words landed heavier than she expected. She crossed her arms again. "Why? Who would do this?" "That's what we're going to find out," Dominic said. She swallowed, forcing herself to steady her breathing. "And what happens to me in the meantime? Am I a prisoner now?" Dominic tilted his head slightly. "Would you rather take your chances out there?" Madeline hated that she didn't have an answer for that. Madeline sat on the edge of a sleek, uncomfortable chair in Dominic's penthouse, her arms crossed so tightly they ached. The room around her was all polished surfaces and curated luxury, but she had no interest in the view, the expensive furniture, or the glass of untouched water sitting in front of her. Her focus was locked on Dominic, who was pacing in front of the windows, his jaw clenched, the tension in his shoulders barely contained. She had spent the last hour enduring his questions, his accusations, his infuriating belief that she was somehow involved in the mess that had detonated both of their lives. But now, for the first time, something had shifted. The questions had stopped. The doubt in his expression had dulled. "Let me get this straight," she said, breaking the silence. "You've had me followed, interrogated, nearly kidnapped, twice now, and you're just now realizing that maybe I didn't steal your money?" Dominic stopped pacing. His dark eyes met hers, unreadable, calculating. "If you had, you wouldn't still be sitting here." "Oh, how reassuring," she muttered, leaning back against the chair. "So what finally convinced you?" He exhaled through his nose, running a hand over his jaw. "Logic. If you had orchestrated this, you wouldn't have walked into a bank asking questions. You wouldn't still be living in a shoebox apartment, and you sure as hell wouldn't be panicking instead of spending the money." Madeline rolled her eyes. "I've been saying that since the beginning." "People lie," Dominic said flatly. "Desperation makes them sloppy. But you," he shook his head. "You don't make sense. This wasn't some long game, some careful con. Which means someone else did this, she finished for him. Dominic's silence was confirmation. Madeline sat up straighter, the weight of everything finally settling into something more than confusion, something close to fear. She had been dragged into a war she hadn't even known was happening. Someone had moved millions of dollars, framed her for it, and nearly gotten her killed in the process. And if she wasn't the one they were after, that meant she was being used as a shield, or worse, a distraction. Before she could say anything, Weston walked in, his expression unreadable, his phone still in his hand. "We found something," he said. Dominic's gaze snapped to him. "Go on." Weston set his phone down on the table and slid it toward Dominic. "Security footage. Monarch Casino. The night of the transfer." Madeline leaned in slightly, her stomach tightening as Dominic pressed play. The screen flickered to life, showing the casino floor, the familiar swirl of people, high rollers, tourists, staff moving in the background. At first, it didn't seem like anything important. And then, the camera panned to a corner of the VIP section, where a man in a perfectly tailored suit stood near the bar, speaking to someone just out of frame. Marcus Langley. Madeline didn't know him, but she knew the name. Dominic's rival. The man whose company had been circling Dominic's like a shark for years, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Dominic's expression darkened. "Langley was there?" Madeline asked, glancing between them. "Not just there," Weston said. "He was watching you." She stiffened. Dominic's fingers tapped against the edge of the table, his mind clearly working through every possible angle. "This isn't a coincidence." Weston nodded. "I dug deeper. Langley's been waiting for the right moment to take you down. Looks like he finally found it." Madeline's stomach twisted. "And I was just, what? The unlucky idiot who got caught in the middle?" Dominic's jaw clenched. "That's exactly what you were." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "And now?" she asked, her voice quieter. Dominic's gaze met hers, sharp and certain. "Now," he said, "we go after him." Madeline sat at the long marble table in Dominic's penthouse, staring at the screen in front of her. The grainy security footage from the casino looped again, showing Langley standing at the bar, his movements casual, his expression unreadable. She had never met him before. Had never spoken his name, had never crossed into his world. And yet, here she was, tangled up in a war she hadn't even known existed. Weston leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It gets worse." Dominic, who had been watching the footage in silence, turned his head slightly. "Go on." Weston tapped his phone and turned the screen toward them. Financial records. Backdated transactions, shell accounts, offshore holdings. He swiped, scrolling through document after document. "Someone inside your company made this possible. It wasn't just an external attack. There was someone giving Langley access." Dominic didn't react right away. He sat back in his chair, fingers steepled together, unreadable. But Madeline felt the shift in the room, the air going sharper. Finally, he spoke. "Who?" Weston exhaled through his nose, like he'd been waiting for the question. "Victor." The name landed with weight. Dominic let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "Victor's been with me for 10 years. "Exactly," Weston said. "Which is why it worked. He knew your systems. Knew the financial backdoors, knew where the weak points were. And more importantly, he knew how to set up a perfect fall guy." Madeline blinked. "Me?" Weston met her gaze. "You." She exhaled, trying to steady the swirl of emotions tightening in her chest. Dominic's jaw flexed. "How long?" "Months," Weston said. "Maybe longer." Langley had been waiting for an opening, and Victor gave it to him. Madeline shook her head. I don't understand. Why me? Why not some faceless account, some offshore transfer? Because Langley is smart, Weston said. He knew if the money landed in some anonymous account, it would raise red flags immediately. He needed someone real. Someone with no connection to you, no history, no access. Someone who, at a glance, would look guilty. Madeline swallowed. And I was just, what? A convenient accident? Weston hesitated. I don't think so. A chill ran down her spine. Dominic leaned forward. What do you mean? Weston shifted his phone again, pulling up another set of files. Victor didn't just pick Madeline at random. He had access to the Monarch's employee database. He knew she worked there. He knew exactly who she was. Madeline stared at the screen. Weston continued. I don't know why yet. But this wasn't luck. She swallowed, the weight of it sinking in. Someone had chosen her. Had put her in the middle of this, deliberately. Dominic's voice cut through the tension. Where is Victor now? Gone, Weston said. Disappeared the second Langley realized we were getting close. Madeline's stomach twisted. So what happens now? Weston hesitated. Dominic didn't. Now, Langley ties up loose ends. The words sent a bolt of cold down her spine. Weston met her gaze. He means you. Madeline's breath caught. Dominic stood, reaching for his phone, already moving. Get the security detail on full lockdown. I want eyes on every possible exit. Weston's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then back at them. Too late. Madeline's pulse hammered. What do you mean, too late? Weston exhaled. I mean Langley already gave the order. She gripped the edge of the table. To do what? Dominic's gaze was steady, cold, certain. To eliminate you. Madeline had barely processed the words before Weston was already moving. The shift in the room was instant, Dominic barking orders into his phone, Weston pulling her toward the door, the air thick with urgency. She was too stunned to resist, too overwhelmed to argue. But as the elevator doors slid shut behind them, the reality settled deep in her chest. Someone out there wanted her dead. And not in the hypothetical, corporate takedown sense. No, this was real. This was permanent. She didn't speak as they moved through the underground parking garage, weaving between sleek black cars, the kind that looked like they belonged to government officials or billionaires with too much money. Dominic's car was waiting, a dark, low-slung vehicle with tinted windows that practically screamed untouchable. Weston opened the back door, nudging her inside before sliding in next to her. The moment the doors locked, Dominic turned from the front passenger seat and met her eyes. You're coming with me. She let out a sharp breath, something between a laugh and a scoff. Oh, am I? Dominic's expression didn't shift. Unless you have a better plan. She didn't. The car pulled out of the garage, the city lights streaking past as they drove. Madeline stared out the window, her thoughts tangled and frantic. She had spent years convincing herself that she could handle anything, that she was independent, untouchable, impossible to fool. And now? Now she was being whisked away under armed security, her entire life detonated overnight. The weight of it pressed against her ribs. She closed her eyes. The drive stretched long and silent until they finally pulled through the gates of Dominic's mansion. And of course, it was exactly what she had expected, vast and sprawling, the kind of place that was more fortress than home. When the car stopped, Weston stepped out first, scanning the perimeter before nodding toward her. She followed, stepping onto the circular driveway, the cool night air sharp against her skin. Dominic didn't say anything as he led her inside. The entryway was cavernous, all sleek marble and high ceilings. Everything about the place was polished, calculated, built for intimidation. Guest room is down the hall, Dominic said, his voice flat. You'll stay there until this is handled. Madeline let out a dry laugh. Right. Because this is totally normal. Dominic turned, his expression unreadable. None of this is normal. But it's necessary. She held his gaze for a moment, something sharp and unspoken passing between them. She didn't trust him. And he didn't trust her. But for now, they were stuck together. Madeline stood at the massive floor-to-ceiling window in the guest room, arms crossed, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn that stretched beyond Dominic's property. The estate was a fortress, gates, cameras, security positioned at every entrance, but she still felt like an intruder, like she was wearing a life that didn't belong to her. She had barely slept. Not because she was afraid. Well, she was afraid, but not in the way most people would be after being nearly kidnapped and targeted for elimination. It was something else. A gnawing, restless frustration that settled in her bones. She hated being here. Hated needing his protection. Hated that her life had been flipped upside down, all because some powerful men had decided to play a game she never asked to be part of. A knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Weston stepped in, looking his usual unbothered self. You're up. Madeline turned. You sound surprised. He smirked. Thought you'd sleep in, given the circumstances. She scoffed. Right. Nothing like an attempted murder to lull me into a restful night. Weston leaned against the doorframe. Come downstairs. Dominic wants to talk. Madeline didn't ask why. She wasn't in the mood for another round of cryptic silence, so she followed him through the massive hallways until they reached a study. Dominic was already inside, standing near a leather chair, staring at a document on his desk. He didn't look up as she entered. Victor's been found. Madeline blinked. Victor? Dominic's jaw tightened. Yes. She glanced at Weston, who nodded. He tried to run. Got as far as a private airfield before we intercepted him. Madeline crossed her arms. So what happens now? You just, what? Lock him in a room and make him talk. Dominic finally looked at her. Something like that. Weston stepped forward, setting a tablet on the desk and pressing play. A video feed appeared, Victor, sitting in a windowless room, looking as wrecked as a man could look while still wearing a $1,000 suit. His usually slicked back hair was a mess, and his fingers tapped against the metal table with nervous energy. A voice crackled through the speaker. You understand what's at stake here, Victor. Victor exhaled sharply. Yeah. I understand. Madeline leaned closer. Is he offering a deal? Dominic said. On the screen, Victor licked his lips, his voice lower now. I give you Langley, I walk. Madeline's stomach twisted. Weston crossed his arms. He's willing to testify. Says Langley had this planned for years. That he knew Dominic wouldn't make a mistake, so he had to create one. Dominic's expression didn't shift, but something flickered behind his eyes. He won't walk. But he might live. Madeline exhaled, running a hand through her hair. So that's it? You let him flip on Langley, and this is over? Dominic's silence was answer enough. Because of course it wasn't over. Langley was too smart, too powerful, too entrenched in the game to go down without a fight. Weston sighed. We've already intercepted chatter. Langley's moving fast, trying to turn Dominic's people against him. If he can't take him down financially, he'll do it another way. Madeline rubbed her temples. Great. Just great. Dominic studied her for a moment. You're handling this better than I expected. She let out a dry laugh. Well, you know. Nearly dying a few times really helps put things in perspective. His gaze didn't waver. That's not what I meant. She frowned. Then what? For a moment, he hesitated. Just a flicker of something in his expression. Then he looked away. Nothing. But she had seen it. The shift. The realization. Whatever walls he had built between them weren't as solid as they had seemed. And for the first time, Dominic Hayes saw himself in her. Madeline sat across from Dominic in his office, arms crossed, watching as he calmly poured himself a drink. He didn't offer her one. Probably because he knew she'd throw it in his face. So, let me get this straight, she said, tapping her fingers against the arm of the chair. Your plan is to invite the guy who tried to ruin your life, and have me killed, by the way, into a room and just hope he confesses? Dominic set the glass down with a soft clink and looked at her like she was missing the point. No. The plan is to make sure he does. Madeline let out a dry laugh. Oh, well, when you put it like that, it sounds totally foolproof. Weston, standing by the window with his usual look of quiet amusement, finally spoke. He won't be able to resist. He thinks he won. Madeline turned to him. And you know this because... Dominic leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. Because Langley's arrogant. He spent years waiting for an opening to take me down, and now he thinks he's done it. He'll come to gloat. She exhaled, shaking her head. I still don't get why I have to be there. Dominic's eyes didn't leave hers. Because you're the reason this worked. You're the piece he didn't expect to matter. She hated that. She hated even more that he was probably right. Weston pulled a small black device from his pocket and placed it on the desk. Hidden recording equipment. We'll have backups in place, but this will be on you. Madeline stared at the tiny microphone like it was a bomb. So I just walk in, sit there, and pray Langley gets cocky enough to incriminate himself? Dominic smirked. Basically. She rolled her eyes. Oh, yeah. Definitely foolproof. Langley arrived at the private lounge of a hotel Dominic owned, just as expected. He walked in with the kind of confidence that made Madeline's stomach twist. He thought this was over. He thought he had won. He greeted Dominic like an old friend, all polished charm and empty smiles. Madeline sat to the side, quiet, watching as the two men exchanged pleasantries like they weren't actively trying to destroy each other. Then Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression amused. I have to admit, Langley, you really went all out this time. Langley smirked. Well, you know what they say. When you see an opportunity, you take it, Dominic finished, nodding. Langley's eyes flickered toward Madeline, his smirk widening. And what a perfect opportunity it was. A bartender, of all things. Plucked straight from obscurity and dropped into the middle of a war she didn't even know she was fighting. Madeline clenched her jaw. Langley turned back to Dominic. It really was elegant, wasn't it? The way the money moved, the way the pieces fell exactly where they needed to. No fingerprints. No loose ends. Dominic lifted his glass. No mistakes. Langley's smirk deepened. None that mattered. Madeline could hear her own heartbeat. Dominic set his drink down, his gaze steady. Good. Then you won't mind explaining exactly how you pulled it off. Langley let out a quiet chuckle. Come on, Dominic. Don't insult me. We both know how this works. Dominic tilted his head slightly. Humor me. Langley exhaled, shaking his head. Fine. You really want to know? He leaned forward, his voice lowering. It wasn't hard. Victor was already halfway out the door. All it took was the right leverage. A little pressure, a little incentive, and suddenly, your money was exactly where I needed it to be. And then? Well. The bartender was just convenient. Madeline's hands curled into fists under the table. Langley grinned. You'd be amazed how easy it is to make someone look guilty. Dominic smiled. And that's when Langley knew. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by something colder. His eyes flicked between them, calculating. Dominic leaned back, calm. That's funny, he said, tapping his fingers against the table. Because I think the police will be amazed too. Langley's expression darkened. Weston stepped forward, pulling a small device from his pocket and holding it up. Nice confession. Thanks for that. Langley's jaw tightened. Madeline allowed herself the smallest smile. Maybe the plan had been foolproof after all. Langley's smirk had barely faded before Weston moved. He didn't rush, didn't make a show of it, just reached into his pocket, pressed a button on his phone, and stepped back like he was waiting for something inevitable. The door to the private lounge burst open. Half a dozen men flooded the room, moving with the kind of controlled precision that didn't allow for arguments. They weren't casino security. They weren't Dominic's men. They were law enforcement. Langley barely had time to process what was happening before one of the officers stepped forward. Marcus Langley, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and embezzlement. For the first time, his confidence cracked. His head snapped toward Dominic, disbelief flashing across his face. You son of a... Dominic just smiled. The officers closed in, one grabbing Langley's arm, another already reciting his rights. He didn't go quietly. His body tensed, his lips curling into a snarl, but there was nothing he could do. The game was over, and he had lost. Madeline sat frozen in her chair, watching as the man who had nearly destroyed her life was yanked to his feet and cuffed like some low-level criminal. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt surreal. One of the officers pocketed the recording device Weston had placed on the table. This should hold up nicely. Dominic nodded once. Make sure it does. Langley turned his glare on him, his hands clenched into fists despite the cuffs. You think this is over? Dominic didn't flinch. I know it is. Madeline's chest tightened. Langley's eyes flicked to her, and something in them made her stomach churn. Not fear, not anger, something else. Something closer to amusement. This whole thing, he muttered, shaking his head as the officers led him toward the door, because of a bartender. The words should have stung. Should have made her feel small. But they didn't. Because she wasn't the one in cuffs. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing through the now empty room. Silence stretched. Weston exhaled. Well. That was satisfying. Madeline let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So, that's it? Dominic glanced at her. That's it. She should have felt relief. And maybe she did. Somewhere underneath the exhaustion, the disbelief, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, maybe relief was there too. Weston checked his phone. Just got confirmation. The accounts are being restored as we speak. He looked up at Dominic. You're whole again. Dominic's expression didn't change, but something in his posture eased. Madeline swallowed. And me? Weston turned to her. Completely cleared. No charges, no ties to the case. You walk away from this clean. Clean. She nodded slowly, trying to let the words sink in. The nightmare was over. And yet, as she sat there, staring at the empty seat where Langley had just been, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something she wasn't ready to name. Dominic sat behind his desk, the skyline of Las Vegas stretching behind him in sharp, golden light. The world was back in order. His money was restored, Langley was in custody, and his company, his empire, stood stronger than ever. And yet, something felt unfinished. Across from him, Madeline sat with her arms crossed, staring at him with that same steady, unreadable expression she always had when she didn't trust someone. Which, in his case, was always. He pushed a thick envelope across the desk. Consider it a settlement. Madeline didn't move. A settlement for what, exactly? For everything you've been through, Dominic said. For the fact that my money landed in your account, that you were nearly killed, that your life was upended because of a war you had nothing to do with. Her lips pressed together. It's more than enough to start over, he continued. Anywhere you want. No strings. Madeline stared at the envelope like it might bite her. Then she exhaled sharply and pushed it right back toward him. No. Dominic blinked, thrown off for the first time in a long time. No. Madeline shook her head. I didn't go through all of this just to have you pay me off like some loose end. It's not a payoff, he said, trying to keep his voice even. It's a way to make things right. She tilted her head slightly. And what do you get out of it? Dominic exhaled, leaning back. Closure. Madeline smirked. Yeah. Me too. She stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. I appreciate the offer. I do. But I've spent enough time letting rich men decide what happens to me. Dominic didn't stop her as she walked to the door, didn't try to convince her. But as she reached for the handle, he couldn't help himself. Where are you going? She glanced back over her shoulder, the smallest smile tugging at her lips. Somewhere quiet. Then she was gone. The town was smaller than she expected. The kind of place where people smiled at each other on the street, where the ocean air clung to everything, and where time moved slower, as if life wasn't in a hurry. Madeline's cafe sat on the corner of a quiet stretch of beach, just far enough from the main road to feel like it belonged to her alone. The sign above the door was new, painted in soft blues and yellows, the name carefully chosen. No one in this town knew who she was. No one cared about billionaires or scandal or the mess that had nearly swallowed her whole. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepping outside just as the sky began to shift, deep purples giving way to soft, pink light. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to run from. No millions. No high-stakes games. Just her. And, finally, peace.